In the hush of a medieval morning, a lone horse trots down the cobblestone streets of Coventry. Upon it rides a woman, completely naked, save for her cascading golden hair, which drapes over her body like a silken veil. Windows are shuttered. The townspeople stay inside, honoring an unspoken vow not to look. The moment is silent, surreal, almost sacred. This is the image that has endured for centuries. Lady Godiva, the noblewoman who, in an act of selfless defiance, rode unclothed through the city to persuade her cruel husband to lift a crushing tax on the poor. It's a tale of sacrifice, virtue, and protest, etched into Western cultural memory like a sacred myth. But what if everything we thought we knew about Lady Godiva was wrong? Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The legend of Lady Godiva has been painted in murals, sculpted into bronze, and whispered across generations. A woman stripped of everything, riding for the people. But legends are slippery things. They are shaped by the hopes and fears of the societies that repeat them, polished by time, and sometimes completely fabricated. What if this ride never happened? What if the true Godiva, whose real name was Godiva, never mounted that horse at all, but wielded her power not through protest, but through land, wealth, religion, and raw political cunning? And what if the story of her naked ride wasn't a memory, but a metaphor? In this episode, we're not retelling the legend, we're dismantling it. We're peeling back centuries of folklore, moralizing, and myth-making to reveal the flesh-and-blood woman beneath the golden hair. We're uncovering a story not of nudity and pity, but of agency, strategy, and survival in one of the most brutal periods of English history. Because the truth is, once the dust of myth settles, what remains is a woman even more fascinating than fiction. For centuries, the image has endured, a noble woman, nude but for her cascading golden hair, riding through the hushed streets of Coventry, windows shuttered, townspeople watching only with their hearts. She sacrifices her dignity to protect the poor, and in doing so, becomes a saint-like figure of compassion and courage. It's a story told in poems, painted in oils, sculpted in bronze. Lady Godiva, they say, begged her husband, the cruel Earl Leofric, to ease an oppressive tax burden on the townsfolk. He mocked her, saying he'd only do so if she rode naked through town. To his astonishment, she accepted. The people respectfully looked away, and Leofric, shamed, relented. It's pure, it's dramatic, and it's almost certainly not true. The earliest known written version of this story didn't appear until the year 1230, nearly 200 years after Godiva's lifetime. It came from a monk named Roger of Wendover, who wasn't writing history but rather morality tales. His version is already shaped by Christian virtue and legend, not primary facts. And the version we know today evolved further. The now infamous Peeping Tom, the tailor who dared to look and was struck blind, didn't appear until the 1600s. This edition added a layer of moral policing, a cautionary tale within a cautionary tale. So why did this myth take hold? Because it's emotionally clean. A single, powerful act that stands in for a lifetime of advocacy. The story doesn't require understanding medieval tax systems or political alliances. It just asks us to remember a woman who gave everything for those with nothing. The myth has become larger than life because it taps into primal themes: sacrifice, virtue, rebellion, shame, and justice. And it centers on something inherently transgressive, a naked woman in public, which draws attention and embeds itself in collective memory. But the simplicity of the story is also its greatest weakness. It erases nuance. It distills Godiva into one moment, one ride, one image. It flattens a complex, powerful figure into a passive symbol. And when we cling too tightly to that image, we risk missing what's even more impressive: the real woman who didn't need to ride unclothed to make history, because she was history. For a story so vivid, so iconic, the legend of Lady Godiva has a strange problem: silence. Not metaphorical silence, but literal absence in the archives, in the chronicles, in the voices of her own time. Godiva, or more accurately Godiva, lived in the mid-11th century. She was the wife of Leofric, Earl of Mercia, and one of the most influential women of her age. Yet the dramatic story of her nude ride through Coventry doesn't appear in any known source during or shortly after her lifetime. In fact, the first written account of the ride doesn't surface until around 1230, almost 200 years after her death. That account comes from Roger of Wendover, a monk at St. Albans Abbey, in a chronicle called Flores Historiarum. His tale, already rich with moral symbolism, reads less like a historical record and more like a parable. This 200-year gap isn't a minor detail, it's a gulf. During that period, England experienced war, conquest, and sweeping political shifts. Yet nowhere, not in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, not in church records, not in contemporary biographies, does anyone mention this supposed act of shocking protest. And why wouldn't they? A noblewoman riding naked through a city would have been scandalous even by medieval standards. It would have made headlines if such a thing existed, but the silence is total. This kind of absence is more than a void. It's a red flag. Historians call this a legendary gap, where stories emerge not from eyewitnesses, but from the long echo of admiration, reimagined over generations. So what happened? Most likely, over time, Godiva's genuine acts of charity and religious patronage morphed into dramatic folklore. Oral tradition thrives on symbols, and a naked ride is far more memorable than a well-drafted land grant. Eventually, Roger, living in a deeply religious and story-hungry culture, recorded what had become a widely circulated tale. Then, centuries later, the story gained even more layers. The addition of Peeping Tom in the 17th century transformed the myth again. He turned a noble act of protest into a tale of voyeurism, punishment, and moral boundaries. And suddenly the story wasn't just about her sacrifice, it was about our reaction to it. By then, the legend had become more powerful than the woman herself. It detached from history and anchored itself in art, literature, and local tradition. But beneath all that silence and all that noise, a real woman existed. She ruled, she signed charters, she influenced kingdoms. And she left behind something more enduring than myth, proof. Forget the legend for a moment. Strip away the horse, the hare, the dramatic protest. What remains is not a weaker figure, but a stronger one, Godiva, whose real life offers more than the myth ever could. Godiva, meaning God's gift in Old English, was not a fantasy. She was a historical force. She appears in royal charters, land records, and the monumental Domesday Book of 1086. These documents don't describe a saint or martyr. They describe a landowner, a political operator, and a woman with influence far beyond the domestic sphere. At the time of King Edward the Confessor's death in 1066, Godiva held lands in at least 10 counties across central England, especially in Warwickshire and Leicestershire. What makes this exceptional is that many of these properties were hers alone, not inherited through marriage. She acquired them before marrying Earl Leofric, and many remained in her name even after his death. This wasn't normal. In the rigidly patriarchal structure of medieval England, noblewomen were often seen as property themselves, vehicles for transferring land between men. Yet here was a woman whose name stood on its own, recognized by kings, monks, and peers. And she wasn't just wealthy, she was politically durable. After William the Conqueror invaded in 1066, nearly the entire Anglo-Saxon nobility was replaced by Norman lords. Their lands were confiscated, their titles erased, but Godiva's name remained in the Domesday Book, a stunning testament to her unique position. She was one of the only pre-conquest nobles, and the only woman of her rank, to still hold significant land after the Normans took control. Why did she survive what so many others didn't? Historians point to her deep ties with the church, her wealth, and likely her reputation as a wise, effective leader. She was not seen as a threat, but as an asset, someone too valuable to erase. And perhaps, by the time William's forces arrived, she had become more symbol than rival. But even before the conquest, she played a key role in the religious and political life of the country. She co-founded abbeys, granted lands to monastic orders, and appeared as a co-signatory on legal documents, unusual for a woman of the time. In those documents, she isn't hidden behind her husband's authority. She shares it. The historical record doesn't show a woman begging for mercy. It shows a woman commanding respect. So why, then, did history replace her with a naked version of herself? Because the truth is harder to simplify. Power built over decades through strategic alliances, estate management, and religious patronage doesn't fit into a bedtime story. But a naked ride? That's unforgettable. Still, if we let go of the myth, we gain something better. A portrait of a woman who didn't need to be rescued, because she was the one building the world others would inherit. She was not merely the wife of a powerful man. She was a power in her own right. In the legend, Godiva's husband is a villain, cold, cruel, and immovable. But the real man behind the myth, Leofric, Earl of Mercia, was far more complicated and far more powerful. Leofric wasn't just Godiva's husband. He was one of the most influential figures in 11th century England. As Earl of Mercia, he held sway over one of the three great territories in the kingdom, alongside Wessex and Northumbria. Mercia was rich in land, soldiers, and political weight, and Leofric knew how to use it. He served under 4 English kings, Canute, Harold Harefoot, Harthacanute, and Edward the Confessor. In a time of constant dynastic struggle, this made him not just a survivor, but a kingmaker. His ability to shift loyalties without losing standing shows the depth of his political instinct. Godiva didn't just marry power, she brought it. Her own family was wealthy and well-connected. Their union wasn't merely romantic or customary, it was strategic. It united 2 powerful houses and reinforced Mercia's dominance in a turbulent age. But what makes this marriage truly exceptional is what came after the wedding. Instead of being overshadowed by her husband, Godiva became a visible partner in power. Together, she and Leofric co-signed legal documents, granted lands to religious institutions, and acted as joint benefactors for massive construction projects, especially religious ones. In a world where women were often politically invisible, she was right there in ink. Their greatest joint legacy was Coventry Abbey, founded around 1043. It wasn't just a place of worship. It was a center of political influence, spiritual legitimacy, and economic growth. Funding such a project required vast resources, and the couple poured wealth into it: gold, jewels, and lavish materials. Their goal wasn't just religious, it was reputational. This was how you cemented status in both heaven and history. The couple's collaboration extended to regional governance. With Leofric handling royal politics and Godiva managing lands and church relations, they operated like a medieval power couple, each handling different fronts, both essential to their dominance. This isn't to say their relationship was without tension. Powerful people rarely live without political differences. But the image of a benevolent wife begging a tyrannical husband to be kind? That doesn't fit what we know. The Godiva-Leofric partnership wasn't one of conflict. It was a calculated alliance. She didn't ride against his will. They rode together, through politics, faith, and legacy. And that's the irony. The myth presents her as a lone moral voice. The history shows her as part of a deliberate, structured pursuit of power. So perhaps the real lesson isn't about rebellion at all. It's about what 2 sharp minds can achieve when they play the long game, not with swords, but with charters, cathedrals, and land. Power in medieval England wasn't measured by swords alone. It was also measured by cathedrals, monasteries, and prayers, and no one understood that better than Godiva and Leofric. Their most enduring creation wasn't a castle or battlefield victory, it was Coventry Abbey, founded around 1043. More than a place of worship, it was a spiritual fortress, a political symbol, and an economic engine that would define a region. Godiva and Leofric didn't just donate, they transformed. Chroniclers marveled at the abbey's riches: golden chalices, gemstone-covered altars, robes threaded with silver. It was said the walls could barely contain the treasure within. But beyond extravagance, this was about public memory. Founding an abbey wasn't just charity, it was strategy. It cemented their legacy in stone and scripture. Monasteries chronicled their benefactors. Monks prayed daily for their souls. And by investing heavily in the church, they bought something no king could revoke: spiritual permanence. And Coventry was just the start. Godiva also donated lands and wealth to churches across England: St. Mary's in Stowe, Wenlock Priory, and others. Each gift extended her influence. These weren't passive acts of piety. They were calculated alliances with the most powerful non-royal institution in Europe, the Church. In a deeply religious society, the Church served as moral authority, political broker, and social gatekeeper. Aligning with it meant protection, credibility, and long-term remembrance. But Godiva went beyond aligning. She embedded herself. Many of her land grants were signed in her own name. Some even included clauses preserving partial control, proof that she wasn't just giving away property, but negotiating complex relationships that benefited both sides. This deep entwinement with faith may also explain her survival after the Norman conquest. While most Anglo-Saxon nobles were stripped of lands, Godiva remained. Her religious stature, combined with strategic silence and enduring goodwill, made her too valuable to erase. One story says that, on her deathbed, she requested her most precious possession, a gemstone rosary, be hung upon a statue of the Virgin Mary in the abbey she built. Whether literal or not, it captures a deeper truth. She converted wealth into legacy, not luxury. And perhaps this is where the myth of the naked ride was born. A woman giving away her riches so selflessly, so visibly, over decades, became, in time, remembered not through financial records, but through metaphor. In folk memory, she didn't shed wealth. She shed clothing. She didn't offer gold. She offered herself. The logic of myth transformed economics into symbolism. But that transformation obscured the greater truth. Because in reality, Godiva didn't need a horse or hare to be remembered. She had bricks and parchment, prayers and papal records. She wasn't a passive figure asking for grace. She was an architect of religious power, a master of what modern politics might call soft influence. She didn't just kneel at altars, she built them. The Norman conquest of 1066 was more than a military victory. It was a total regime change. King Harold fell. The Anglo-Saxon nobility was dismantled. Land was ripped from native lords and handed to Norman newcomers. The Old England died almost overnight. But not all of it. When William the Conqueror commissioned the Domesday Book in 1086, a vast survey of who owned what, one name from the pre-conquest world still appeared: Godiva. She wasn't just mentioned. She was recorded as a landholder, owning estates across multiple counties. At a time when nearly every Anglo-Saxon noble had been erased, here was a woman, old, perhaps nearing the end of her life, still present, still counted. It's a remarkable exception. Why was she spared when others weren't? Historians suggest several possibilities. First, she likely did not resist William's invasion. While other nobles raised armies and declared loyalty to doomed kings, there's no record of Godiva opposing the new regime. Her silence may have been strategic, a way of preserving what could be saved. Second, her deep ties to the church made her harder to target. Monasteries across England owed her land, funding, and prestige. Removing her could have stirred unrest among religious institutions, the very allies William needed most to stabilize his rule. Third, her status had shifted. By the time of the conquest, she may have been seen less as a political threat and more as a respected elder, a relic of the old guard, revered but no longer dangerous. Removing her would gain William little and risk unnecessary backlash. But most important of all, she had made herself indispensable. She was a donor, a land manager, and a name written into legal systems, charters, and monastic records. The new regime didn't just conquer territory, it needed to administer it. Godiva, with her vast holdings and loyal networks, was already doing that. Better to let her stay than risk instability. It's worth noting that the land she held was often listed as in her own right, not inherited from her husband or held through a male relative. This distinction matters. It implies legal ownership, recognition, and, most critically, respect. While male lords fell in war or were stripped by decree, Godiva survived by being irreplaceable. This wasn't passive endurance. It was masterful adaptation. She didn't protest, she didn't plead, she didn't rebel. She remained by being too valuable, too intertwined, too wise to remove. In doing so, she became a living bridge, connecting two Englands, one dying, the other being born. And here's the final twist. While history records kings and conquerors, it often forgets the survivors. But in this case, it didn't. It remembered her, not in legend, but in ledger. Not for what she lost, but for what she kept. By now, it's clear. The naked ride never happened. No contemporary records, no eyewitnesses. Only a monk writing 2 centuries later, capturing not history, but legend. And yet, the story endured. Why? because even if the event was invented, the emotion behind it resonated. Over generations, folk memory didn't forget Godiva. It transformed her, and in that transformation, the truth became not factual, but symbolic. Let's break that down. In her lifetime, Godiva gave away land, wealth, and influence to religious institutions. She built abbeys, funded monks, supported the church with near unmatched generosity. These acts were not quiet. They were public, recorded, and deeply respected. To the people of Coventry and beyond, she was a noblewoman who gave again and again, not only to God, but to the poor. Over time, this image of generosity may have been reimagined in the only language that sticks in memory: drama. Instead of giving treasure, she gave herself. Instead of wealth, she shed clothes. Instead of a ledger, we got a legend. This is how myth is born, not from lies, but from emotional simplification. A dramatic image communicates sacrifice better than a receipt. And for people living in oral cultures, symbols endure longer than facts. The legend also offered moral clarity. A woman challenges male authority. The people honor her. Justice is served. It's cinematic, neat, and deeply satisfying. But that wasn't enough. Enter Peeping Tom, added to the story over 400 years later. His presence introduces a new moral layer. Not just about sacrifice, but how we respond to it. He looks. He's punished. The audience is reminded. Some acts are sacred, not to be violated by curiosity or lust. Peeping Tom makes the legend interactive. He's not just a character, he's a warning. And yet, ironically, his inclusion shifts focus. The story becomes not just about Godiva's bravery, but about our gaze. Do we admire? Do we leer? Do we exploit? This is why the story persists, not because it's true, but because it's useful. Artists, churches, and cities could shape it to their needs. Morality play, tourist attraction, feminist fable. But in all that adaptation, something was lost: the real woman. Because the truth is harder to sell. A powerful landowning woman navigating politics, church alliances, and dynastic collapse isn't easy to paint on a mural. But that's what Godiva was. She wasn't riding naked. She was writing charters, negotiating donations, surviving empires. And that's more impressive. Still, we don't need to throw away the myth. We just need to see it for what it is. A metaphor, not a memory. A symbol of sacrifice, drawn from real generosity. An image shaped by admiration, not fact. And maybe, just maybe, that metaphor tells us something profound. When people can't explain greatness, they invent drama to contain it. So yes, the naked ride is a fabrication. But the awe behind it? That was always real. The legend of Lady Godiva gave the world an unforgettable image: a woman, exposed and defiant, standing alone for justice. But the truth, the story of Godiva, offers something deeper, something more enduring. She didn't ride through town naked. She didn't need to. She held land in a world where women rarely owned anything. She negotiated with kings, signed legal documents, funded massive religious institutions, and maintained power through one of the most violent regime changes in English history. Her story isn't one moment of protest. It's a lifetime of presence. Godiva mastered what truly mattered in the 11th century: land, faith, and survival. She used her wealth to buy loyalty, not just from people, but from the most powerful institution in Europe, the Church. Through her donations, she ensured her name was remembered, prayed for, and written down long after others vanished. And when the Normans came and swept away nearly every Anglo-Saxon lord, she remained, not because of luck, but because she was too important to erase. That's legacy. But why do we cling to the legend instead? Because the ride is easy to remember, it's emotional, it makes her a saint, a symbol of sacrifice. It turns her into something we can admire without having to understand. But that's the tragedy. The real woman was more powerful than the myth ever allowed her to be. She wasn't a passive victim or a desperate wife. She was a strategist, a builder, a survivor. And she teaches us something crucial. You don't have to be mythologized to be magnificent. In fact, sometimes the most myth-worthy people are the ones history tried to flatten, the women who weren't loud but effective. Not flashy, but foundational. Godiva's legacy is a reminder that quiet power is still power. That you can shape a kingdom not with one defiant act, but with decades of decisions that ripple long after you're gone. So yes, let the statue of Lady Godiva stand in Coventry, let the murals remain, let the story be told. But let it be told alongside the truth. Let people know that behind the legend was someone even more formidable, a woman who didn't just ride for justice, but built the systems that made justice possible. Because in the end, Godiva's greatest triumph wasn't the ride that never happened. It was the life that actually did. Legends are easy to remember. A woman rides naked through town, shaming a cruel husband, saving the poor. It's vivid, emotional, simple. But simplicity often hides complexity. When we look beyond the legend of Lady Godiva, we don't find a disappointing truth. We find a richer one. Her real name was Godiva, and her legacy was not built in one dramatic moment, but across decades of political strategy, land management, and spiritual investment. She owned property in her own name across England. She helped found Coventry Abbey, turning it into a regional powerhouse. She appeared in legal charters alongside her husband, not as decoration, but as an equal partner. And she survived one of the most violent transitions in English history, the Norman Conquest. While others lost everything, she endured. Her name remained in the Doomsday Book, a record not of myth, but of measurable impact. Why does this matter? Because the myth reduces her to a moment. The history reveals her as a master of longevity. She played a long game, building power through faith, alliances, and deliberate generosity. Her influence outlasted kings. The naked ride, as iconic as it is, wasn't necessary. The truth is more powerful. Godiva didn't need to undress to be noticed. She was already unignorable. And that's what we reclaim when we set the legend aside. Not a smaller figure, but a greater one. A woman who navigated a brutal world with intelligence and resolve. A woman whose real strength wasn't spectacle, it was structure. Let the story remain. Let it inspire. But let it share space with the truth. Because in the end, the real Godiva didn't just ride into legend. She built the ground beneath it.